Welcome to the 2021 Science and Faith Virtual Symposium. We are incredibly excited that you are here to join us today and explore this really interesting topic. But before we get rolling, I'd like to share a few logistics with you all. First, if you could leave off your video and your microphone, we would really appreciate it. We want to hear your feedback, and we definitely want you to have the ability to ask questions. But since there's going to be so many of us on the call, if we all have our videos and microphones on, things can get a bit chaotic. So what we're going to do is we're going to allow each speaker to go ahead and give their presentation uninterrupted. And then at the end of their presentations, we will have a question and answer session via the chat. So during the talk, if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and type those in the chat, or if you want to wait till after the presentation, you can type them in there as well. We'll have a few people who are monitoring the chat, and then they will present those questions to the speaker. And they'll synthesize them. So if there's two questions that are similar, perhaps they'll combine them, that sort of thing. But yeah, that's how we're going to handle the interactive portion of this symposium. I did also want to let you know that if you want to have the speaker be on full screen view for you, you can go to the top right corner of your screen and hit view or view options. And then you can scroll down and you can make the speaker be full screen for you. So that should give you a better viewing experience there. We would also like to thank Nutramax. They are one of our sponsors, and in particular, they're sponsoring this meeting here today. They're a fantastic company. They help us out at the Christian Veterinary Mission a lot, so we'd like to thank them. Definitely give them a look because they're a wonderful group of people. So yeah, check them out for sure. And then finally, toward the end of each presentation, we'll be posting a link to a Google form in the chat. So if you'd like to learn more information about Christian Veterinary Mission or Ratio Christi, go ahead and fill that information out for us. And then also, if you're an NC State student and you're attending the meeting and you want the diversity credit, or if you want to receive the gift card that we offered, go ahead and mark that in the Google form as well that we'll post at the end. We will also give away the free book, which for this session will be a book by Dr. Alastair McGrath, and also a $20 Giftogram gift card. We'll do those giveaways at the end of each presentation. So science and faith, are they in conflict or could they be complementary? Should humans even have a need for faith today in the midst of all of the astounding scientific achievements we see? Or is God just a mystery that's getting smaller and smaller as science continues to progress? In the face of such a huge and nuanced question, disagreement is really inevitable. So whether you're an atheist, an agnostic, or even if you are a Christian, there's a good chance that during the course of this symposium, someone might say something with which you disagree. And in fact, if you're able to listen to all the discussions we have lined up for you through this symposium, you might even discover that some of our speakers could disagree on certain frameworks or points of philosophy. But our goal is not to snuff out disagreements. Instead, we want to foster a civil and most of all, a charitable discussion on this very important topic. So we ask that regardless of your background in regards to faith or religion, you keep an open yet thoughtful mind. Because who knows, perhaps you'll discover something new about science, faith, or both. And maybe we'll see that science and faith together can bring something to the table that neither can on its own. So starting us off today from across the pond in Oxford, England, is Dr. Alister McGrath. He is a scientist and an Anglican priest holding doctorate degrees in both biochemistry and theology. And his critiques of the scientific atheism movement, which is popular has attracted international attention. As a former atheist, he brings a powerful yet respectful perspective to today's conversations on science and faith. Currently, he serves as the Andreas Idrios Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford, and he's also a senior research fellow at Harris Manchester College. So we are incredibly excited to virtually bring him to you today. I really can't think of a better person to start this conversation off for us. So welcome to the symposium, Dr. Alastair McGrath.
Well, thank you very much. It's really great to be with you. And I'm going to talk about science and religion. I'm going to tell you how I got interested in this. I'm going to tell you how I hold these together and kind of give you some ideas about what you can make of this. So again, this is very much me sharing my ideas. I'm not saying this is right, this is wrong. I'm just saying this is what I find helpful. Maybe it will help you as well. So let's go back to the late 1960s. I mean, that's a long time ago, but that's when I was a teenager growing up in Northern Ireland. And back in those days, I was a kind of rebellious, free-thinking atheist who loved the natural sciences and actually had an intense dislike for ambiguity and uncertainty. And I was convinced that science and religious belief were simply incompatible. Science was about facts. And as far as I was concerned, religious belief was about running away from reality, just making up your beliefs to suit your tastes. But I'm now a lapsed atheist, and I don't really have any hostility towards atheism at all. It's a position I respect, even though I no longer hold it myself. So let me tell you about how my love of science began. It began with a sense of wonder at the beauty of the natural world, I think especially the night sky. And I often had that feeling, and maybe you've known this feeling as well, of standing on the threshold of some kind of new world, which invited me to come and discover it. A great uncle of mine who headed up the pathology department at the big teaching hospital in Belfast heard about my growing interest in nature, and he gave me an old German microscope he had used when he was a medical student back in the first decade of the 20th century. And actually, I still have it. Here it is. This is the microscope that really kind of got me interested in nature. As you can see, it's very old. But anyway, this microscope opened up the wonders of nature for me. And actually it still sits on the shelf in my study to remind me of my great uncle, but also the power of nature to kind of intrigue us and provoke questions. And I went on to build myself a small telescope so I could see the moon, the planets, and the stars. And all of that made me want to be a scientist. So I ended up specializing in mathematics and natural science as a teenager. And eventually I set myself the goal of studying chemistry. I love chemistry at Oxford University. And all of that was really very exciting. But, it was also a bit puzzling, because the more I understood about how our world functioned, well, the more pointless it seemed. I mean, the starlit heavens they might seem very beautiful, but they were just, for me, elegant symbols of cosmic meaninglessness. I found myself struggling to come to terms with the apparent insignificance of human beings in terms of the time scale of the universe. And these very unsettling thoughts were kind of triggered off by a group of 3 stars in the night sky. You may know them. They're at the center of the constellation of Orion. It's a very prominent feature of the winter night sky right now. And the textbooks told me that those 3 stars, sometimes known as the belt of Orion, was so far away from us that the light from the furthest of them took 1,000 years to reach Earth. So actually, it was a kind of form of time travel. I was seeing the light from those stars, not as it had been, but actually as it had been 1,000 years ago. But I really felt very strongly that this was all about insignificance, because the light now leaving that star wouldn't get here till 1,000 years later, and I'd be dead by then. So really, the night sky was a symbol of insignificance. When I was 16, I became a committed atheist. I think there were a number of reasons for this. One of them was my belief that science was the only form of knowledge. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I was very intolerant of uncertainty at that time. I loved science, I think, partly because it gave me clear and certain answers. Science, I believed, was about proven truths. They could be trusted and relied upon, but religion was just, kind of running away from reality. But I also shared the very widespread belief back then that science and religion were at war with each other. And so as I loved science, this meant I had to oppose religion. And, that's what everyone thought back in the 1960s, but I'm sure many of you will know modern scholarship has really kind of thoroughly dismantled this idea. The modern scholarly consensus is that while there can be points of tension between science and religion, it's complicated. I mean, there's no right way of understanding their relationship, and it certainly isn't this myth of perennial warfare. So you might look at, for example, the historian of science, Thomas Dixon, who says this idea of a perennial war between science and religion is really a myth invented by Enlightenment rationalists back in the late 1700s, then kind of propagated by Victorian free thinkers in the late 1800s, and is defended today really by scientific atheists like Richard Dawkins, who don't actually know very much about history. And for Dixon, who's a historian, the idea of the perpetual warfare of science and religion is really a piece of intellectual junk. But my third reason for embracing atheism was actually linked with Northern Ireland, which is where I was born and where I grew up. And in the late 1960s, what the Irish, I think rather euphemistically call the Troubles, began to develop. And although the politics of identity were a major cause of the social tensions and violence that broke out around that time, my atheist friends at the time argued that the real problem was religion. And many of my friends were Marxists, and they argued if there was no religion, there'd be no religious violence. Well, that made sense to me, although I have to say I can now see it was a rather simplistic argument. So back in the late 1960s, these three reasons to be an atheist seemed absolutely compelling to me. Atheism seemed to be the only serious intellectual option for an intelligent scientist like me. And I took the view that religious people were, in my view, mad, sad, or bad, quite possibly all three. And I took the view Marx was right, that religion was a kind of opiate, dulling our intellectual senses. And so I enjoyed a rather smug feeling of intellectual superiority over those who clung on to their outmoded belief in God. And I saw myself as a kind of accidental byproduct of blind cosmic forces. You know, you talk about direction, but not purpose in the universe. And I felt that the bleakness and the dreariness of my atheism actually was certain indications of its truth. Why? Well, because this is so dull. Nobody's actually going to want to believe this kind of stuff. So there I was at the age of 16, and I felt I'd sorted out all the really important issues in life. So I could focus on getting a place at Oxford University to study chemistry, and happily I managed to do that. And in December 1970, I learned I'd won a scholarship to study chemistry at Oxford with effect from October 1971. So what was I going to do in the meantime? I had about 9 months on my hand. Now, most of my friends had stayed on at my school to take the Oxford, but I thought I would stay on. I would use the time to learn German and Russian, which would both be helpful for science. And I also wanted to deepen my knowledge of biology. And so I sat down to really begin an extended period of reading and reflection in the school library. And after a month or so of intensive reading in the school science library, I came across a section of books that I had never noticed before. And the label on the shelf was The History and Philosophy of Science. And they were covered in dust. Nobody seemed very interested in them, so I blew off the dust and started reading. And by the time I'd finished reading those books, I realized I had a lot of rethinking I needed to do. I discovered that my view of science actually was really rather naive and actually completely inconsistent with the history of science. And I'd failed to appreciate the importance of issues like, for example, the underdetermination of theory by data, or the radical theory change in the history of science, and the really complicated question about how on earth you decide what is the best explanation of a given set of observations. So actually, things turned out to be rather more complicated than I had thought. And I began to realize that my view of science was actually incredibly simplistic. If you like, I kind of enjoyed the rather nice beauty and innocence of a childlike attitude to the natural sciences. And I have to say, actually, that many of these views continue to be repeated today in the writings of Richard Dawkins. However, for me, there was no going back. I'd stepped through a door, and I just couldn't escape the new and the rather less certain world I had now discovered. Now, let me make it clear, these lines of thought didn't call into question my atheism at that stage, nor did they move me towards religious belief, but they did cause me to pause for thought, because I realized things were not as simple as I had thought. So I began to ask myself some rather awkward questions. For example, what exactly was the evidential basis of my atheism? What exactly had I found in atheism that caused me to embrace it? Well, you know, at the time it was very trendy. It also seemed to be the way things were going, and it irritated people that I disliked. It also, I think, resonated with my desire for autonomy. I wanted to be able to do what I liked, instead of having to act in accord with some greater or better good, which was not of my own choosing or creating. Yet, I have to admit, I did feel a bit uncomfortable about this. I mean, it did seem rather similar to Sigmund Freud's idea of a wish fulfillment, in which you invent a worldview that fits in with what you actually want. Now, Freud argued that we invent an imaginary God to console ourselves, and the thought went through my mind that maybe I'd invented my atheism so I could be free of any interference or influence from some transcendent reality and thus be free to do whatever I wanted. I have to say that later I discovered many atheists actually explicitly do this. For example, you might think of philosopher Thomas Nagle, who actually I really like, and I engage him a lot in my recent writings. And he was very open about the basis of his atheism. His desire was that there should be no God. Now, listen to what he says. I think it's very interesting. I quote, "It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope I'm right. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that." Now, Nagel's line of thought, I think, is very clear. His desire for a godless world actually gave rise to his intellectual defense of this belief. But coming back to this question, what were the objective evidential grounds of my atheism? I dismissed religious belief because it couldn't be proved. But what if religion proved to be typical of our knowledge of reality rather than exception to it? If beliefs that really matter lay beyond absolute proof, then any ethical or social or religious ideas would probably count as faith. And I began to become aware, I have to say uncomfortably aware, that my own defining belief that there is no God actually lay beyond proof. And so I found myself facing the rather disturbing possibility that my atheism might actually be a faith, something that could not be proved to be true. Well, anyway, I decided I'd sort all these questions out when I got up to Oxford, where I'd hopefully meet some intelligent atheists who would reaffirm my commitment to atheism and put an end to these nagging doubts. But actually, unfortunately, that wasn't how things worked out. So I went to Oxford to study chemistry, and in my first year, I specialized in quantum theory. And one of the writers I really spent a lot of time engaging with was Albert Einstein. And as I'm sure you know, Einstein's writings show an interest in areas way beyond the field of natural sciences. They include ethics, politics, and also religion. And what makes Einstein particularly interesting is he sees all of these as being interconnected. And Einstein has this basic idea that science is wonderful. I agree with that. But that it needs to be supplemented and enriched if we're going to engage with the really important questions in life. And his view is that science, politics, and ethics are all different, but they all have a role to play in helping us to put together a big picture of life. And so for Einstein, well, science and religion are different, but that does not make them incompatible. Science and ethics, for example, are completely different fields of thought, but that doesn't mean scientists can't be ethical people. So Einstein affirmed to me that science is a vitally important part of our understanding of the world, but science only illuminates part of the big picture of reality and not the whole picture. And Einstein's view is that we need a grander vision of reality than that which science can offer if we're going to live authentic and meaningful lives. In other words, we need to be able to weave together an objective scientific account of our world with our deepest existential needs and longings and aspirations. Science is great, but a scientific account of reality is incomplete. But I wasn't just reading Einstein during my first term in Oxford. I was talking to scientists. I discovered rather a lot of these were actually intelligent religious believers. And they would talk to me about how their faith motivated their love for science and how they found their science was enriched by their faith. And I began to realize that I had quite a lot of rethinking to do. I'd never really grasped, I think, what Christianity was all about. In fact, I have to say, I'd never really taken the trouble to find out. I mean, for example, I thought that faith was simply accepting the existence of God, which is on the same intellectual level as accepting the existence of an additional moon orbiting the planet Jupiter. I just couldn't see how that made any difference to real life. And as a teenage atheist, I was deeply impressed when the first Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin declared there was no sign of any God up there. That was back in April 1961. But actually, it's hard to ignore the force of C.S. Lewis's response to that bold statement. He said it was like Hamlet going up into the attic of his castle and declaring that Shakespeare wasn't there. Anyway, my Christian friends, as I discovered, spoke about faith in a very different way. They talked about their faith in terms of discovering meaning and purpose within life. And faith wasn't about assent to the existence of an irrelevant God, but about the discovery, the embrace of a transcendent reality underlying our world who could be known and trusted. And I began to realize I'd rejected a caricature of Christianity, not the real thing. I think through these conversations during my first time in Oxford, I began to realize that belief in God actually brought about an enriched understanding and appreciation of the world, especially as we begin to develop this through the natural sciences. So to cut a long story short, I set to one side my atheism and embraced Christianity. Now, this was actually a rather cerebral, a rather intellectual conversion, and it really focused on my growing realization that belief in God made a lot more sense of things than my former atheism. So, if you like, I'd entered a strange new world and had to begin to explore this. And actually, C.S. Lewis was really important as I began to do this. I first began to read C.S. Lewis back in 1974. And this was the final sentence of one of the first things I read by C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And that's a really powerful image, and it kind of way stimulated my imagination as much as my reason. I mean, you might like to imagine, as I did, you're standing on a dark hill before dawn, and the landscape around you is dark and shrouded in mist, and then the sun begins to rise, gradually illuminating the landscape and burning off the mist, allowing us to see it more clearly. And sure, shadows and mist remain, but we can see things more clearly than before. And Lewis here really gave me, if you like, a big picture of our world, which helps me to bring things into focus. It was as if an intellectual sun had risen and illuminated the scientific landscape in front of my eyes, allowing me to see details and interconnections that otherwise I would simply have missed altogether. Now, once I'd been drawn to atheism because of the minimalism of its intellectual demands, but I now really found myself discovering the richness of the intellectual outcomes of Christianity. And for me, Lewis helped me to realize that in embracing Christianity, I did not have to abandon reason or science. I wasn't committing intellectual suicide. And for Lewis, human reason was illuminated and energized through faith so that it could transcend its natural limitations. And in that essay I quoted from, Lewis talks about, in effect, offering a vision of Christianity which is intellectually capacious. He says it can fit in science, art, and morality. And that, I think, was really important to me because it meant I could think of science and faith and ethics and all these things being integral elements of a bigger picture of reality, a coherent way of looking at our world. And I began to realize my Christian faith was like a lens that seemed to be able to bring clarity to life, bringing things into focus. And Lewis, I think, was the first Christian writer I encountered who articulated so clearly this idea of Christianity as a big picture of reality. So what I really experienced here is what we might now call an epiphany, if you like, a sudden illumination of what up to that point had been a rather dark landscape, a bit like, pulling a lens into focus and beginning to see things clearly for the first time. So that's how I began to really inhabit the Christian world. How did it in effect shape the way in which I understood the relationship between my faith and my love of science? That's what you want me to talk about. And I think that's a really important question, because most of my scientist friends who are Christian used a kind of let's bolt it together somehow model to relate their science and faith. They would say, look, we can do this somehow. They're not inconsistent somehow, but that wasn't good enough for me. I was looking for something much more rigorous as a way of holding together my science and my faith. In other words, not just saying, they can be made to be consistent, but that there's some way of holding this together. Well, I found this several months later when I heard a sermon preached in my college chapel by Charles Coulson. Now, by Charles Coulson, I don't mean Nixon's right-hand man in the White House, who kind of got into trouble at Watergate. I'm talking about Oxford University's first professor of theoretical chemistry, who was also a very prominent Methodist lay preacher. And he had given a lot of thought to the relation of science and faith. And I heard him preach a sermon on precisely that topic. And his words really changed my thinking permanently, as if a light was turned on in my mind, allowing me to see the relation of science and faith in a new way. So I'm going to talk now about how I now see this. Many of you will say, well, look, surely if science is true, then everything else is false. And, I used to think that, but I don't think that now. I realize some people would say, well, look, if science is right, there's no need for Christianity. And I want to make the point that's a very good question. If science and religion are asking precisely the same questions, then you might well say, well, look, the answers are in competition. So we have to choose which of them is right. But actually, it's not that simple. We need to think of human knowledge in terms of a spectrum of possibilities. Some knowledge is scientific, some is historical, some is ethical, some is religious. So let me explore this question in dialogue with Mary Midgley. Mary Midgley is one of Britain's best known and respected public philosophers who died recently, aged 99. I actually got to know her when I was giving a lecture in 2008 up at the University of Newcastle in the northeast of England. And I was talking about Richard Dawkins' views of science and religion, and Midgley asked me to meet her afterwards for a cup of tea. And she talked to me about how she understood the relationship of science and faith and ethics and philosophy. And here's what she thinks, because I think you'll find this really interesting. So as I explain what she thinks, just ask yourself, does this seem to make sense? Midgley argues that different disciplines use different intellectual toolkits. They have to, because otherwise they can't capture the complexity of the world and simply reduce the world to whatever that toolkit is able to handle. And Midgley's point is that these different intellectual toolkits are designed to ask different intellectual questions. So what Midgley argues is that there are some questions that are really important for human beings that science can't answer using its own toolkits. And what Midgley is getting at here really is the dangers of what she calls scientific overreach, but she's also protesting against the intellectual impoverishment that results from limiting our knowledge and understanding of the world to what results from a single toolkit. Here's what she says. I think actually this captures this point very, very well. This is Midgley talking now, not me. No one pattern of thought, not even physics, is so fundamental that all others will eventually be reduced to it. Instead, for most important questions in human life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. In other words, different toolboxes for different areas of inquiry. And Mitchell summed this up in her final book, What is Philosophy For? And again, I think she's well worth listening to. I've always found her helpful. Maybe you will as well. This is Midgley speaking again. On the one hand, I want to emphasize that there really is only one world. But on the other, that this world is so complex that we need dozens of different thought patterns to understand it. We can't reduce all these ways of thinking to any single model. Instead, we have to use all our philosophical tools to bring these distinct kinds of thought together. Now, I think she's very interesting, and the point she's making is that science simply cannot answer all our questions about life. It's very good at answering scientific questions, but not moral, existential, or religious questions, especially anything to do with value or meaning in life. Now, Richard Dawkins, who I've debated on several occasions, would not agree with this, because for Dawkins, science is the only reliable intellectual authority, and science puts everyone else out of business. And as you probably know, this view is now known as scientism, and it became the hallmark of the kind of new atheism that Dawkins and others developed from 2006, although that's now, I think, gone out of fashion. Let me tell you more about this. The view that science only can tell us what's right, that science only can give us reliable knowledge about reality, has been widely criticized by philosophers, whether they are religious or atheist, precisely because of its failure to respect the complexity of our world and the need for multiple research methods to engage it properly. And the new atheism really is a sort of naive scientific positivism, which lacks any familiarity with the history of philosophy of science, and actually gained cultural attention, in my view, largely because of its crude parody of religion rather than the quality of its arguments. So let's set that behind us. New atheism just isn't really very reliable. Instead, what I'm going to do is set out 3 ways of understanding how science and faith relate to each other. I found each of these helpful, and the question is whether these are of any interest or use to you. And I suppose the good news is you don't have to choose between them, because actually each of them has their own strengths and merits, and you don't find them actually contradicting each other. Let me talk through each of these and try to help you get a sense of their strengths and weaknesses. Here's what they are, then I'll talk about them in more detail. First of all, science and faith offer us different perspectives on reality. Second, science and faith answer questions at different levels. And thirdly, science and faith offer us different maps of reality. So let's look at each of these. So the first of these is that science and faith offer us different perspectives on reality. And this is actually quite important for me because I learned this from Charles Coulson, as I was saying, back at Oxford in the early 1970s. And I hadn't really found a satisfactory way of holding science and faith together. And Coulson explained to me they could be seen as offering different perspectives on a complex reality. It's a very easy idea to understand. Imagine something that's really complex. It looks different from different angles. Now, Coulson was a very keen mountaineer. And in fact, while he was up in Scotland, he spent a lot of time climbing Scottish mountains, including Ben Nevis, Scotland's biggest mountain. And Coulson noticed this complex structure looked different when it was seen from different angles of approach. From the south, it was very grassy. From the north, it was very rocky. And Coulson made the point that if you wanted to give a full account of Ben Nevis, you could not limit yourself to any single perspective. You had to find a way of integrating, of weaving together multiple perspectives into a single whole. That's how Coulson puts it. I think it's quite a neat way of doing it. Each observer looks at the mountain Each sees certain things and each tries to describe his encounter with the mountain. Each devises a language suitable for their own purpose. Different views of the same reality, Coulson writes, will appear different, and yet they'll all be valid. So the key point here is you need to find a way of weaving together multiple perspectives on a complex reality, because if you leave something out, you impoverish and you distort. It's not the reality, it's simply a reduced account of it. That's a very simple analogy, and it's easily applied to the relation of science and faith. We need an cumulative, integrated view of reality, and both science and religion offer their distinct perspectives, which are valid, yes, but they're also incomplete. So the key point here is the human experience of reality is complex, and there is space for both scientific and religious approaches to grasping that reality. But Coulson is very critical of those who say, my own perspective is it, nothing else. I'm right, there's nothing else to be added. Coulson is very critical of those who cannot or will not look at the world from more than one viewpoint, or someone, again I quote, who claims an exclusive authority for his own description. I think the key point here is simply complex reality, multiple angles of approach. Let's find a way of bringing these together. I mentioned Mary Midgley. Let's stay with her because she develops a similar approach using the image of windows on our world rather than perspectives. And her argument is that we need many windows if we're going to represent the complexity of reality. And she gives us an analogy, which is slightly different from Coulson's. She says, let's think of the world as a huge aquarium. So try and enter into her analogy. Think of a huge aquarium with lots of viewing windows into its many regions. Now, here's what she says. We cannot see it as a whole from above. So we peer into it through a number of small windows. And we can eventually make quite a lot of sense of this habitat if we patiently put together the data from different angles. But if we insist that our own window is the only one worth looking through, we shan't get very far. Now, I think that's helpful. The point Midgley is making is really very simple. If we are dealing with something that's complex, whether it's an aquarium or life or the world, we have to approach it using multiple intellectual toolkits, multiple windows through which we look. And our account of this complex reality will have to weave together the insights that we gain through looking through each window. And obviously, some people are tempted to look at the world only through their own window. So Midgley is saying it's a complicated world. We can't do that. We need multiple research methods. We need multiple windows. Let's find a way of bringing these together. So that's my first approach. Here's my second. Think of science and faith answering life's questions on different levels. In other words, you're saying that there are ways of engaging questions which are certainly scientific, but there are also ways of engaging certain questions that are not scientific. So I think an analogy is called for, and let me give you an analogy. It is not original to me. This analogy I'm going to give you, as far as I can see, was first used by the geologist Frank Rhodes, who went on to become president of Cornell University. What's the analogy? Well, it is a kettle that is boiling. So imagine a kettle that's boiling. Question, why is that kettle boiling? And Rhodes points out you can answer this question at different levels. No one answer is definitive or exhaustive. So here is a scientific answer to the question, why is the kettle boiling? Well, energy is being converted, and that raises the temperature of the water to its boiling point. Obviously, I give you a rather fuller version of that, but it's obviously correct. That's a scientific answer. The question is, does a scientific answer, in effect, say there are no other answers? And of course, the question is no, because here's another question, another answer given to that same question. Why is the kettle boiling? And as you'll see, this answer works at a completely different level. Here's the second answer. The kettle is boiling because I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. Yeah, I'm British. That's what we do here. And the point is that answer is also correct. Each of those two answers is valid. So let's make sure we've appreciated this point. If the scientific answer is right, does that mean that the other one, the cup of tea one, is wrong? Well, no, it doesn't. Let's listen to Frank Rhodes's own answer to that question, and here's what he has to say. These are different answers, but both are true, both are complementary and not competitive. There's a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. You can see that's quite helpful. His basic point is that both answers are right because they're concerned with different levels of reality. And Rhodes speaks of a complementarity of description, which tries to capture at least something of the total picture of reality. If you're going to give a complete account of the reasons for the kettle boiling, you have to identify all the factors involved and not just one or two of them. Now, I think that's really helpful because this framework allows us to explore the idea that the natural sciences are mainly concerned with understanding how things function, how they work, whereas religion's more concerned with understanding what they mean, what we mean. And these are different levels of engagement. I make that point very clearly. These are things that can be engaged in different ways, and you can bring them together to give a fuller and richer understanding of the nature of humanity and indeed the nature of the world. So that's approach number 2. Approach number 3, I'm afraid we're going back to Marian Midgley because, as you probably gathered, I quite like her. Now, this approach is very different. This is based on the idea that science and faith offer different maps of reality. And what Midgley argues is that because reality is so complex, we have to use multiple maps to make sense of it. And the point is that each map we might use to try and make sense of our world is incomplete. No one map on its own is good enough. So let's follow her analogy through. I want you to consider an atlas which provides us with many maps of a region, for example, North America, or maybe Europe. Now you might say, well, look, why do we need multiple maps of such landscapes? And why not just have one? That's good enough. Well, there's not, you see. Midgley, in dealing with this objection, points out that different maps provide different information about the same reality. And the reason that we need multiple mappings of reality is that each mapping is incomplete and focuses on some specific question. So here's what Midgley has to say. Listen to her. No map shows everything. Each map concentrates on answering a particular set of questions. Each map explains the whole only in the sense of answering certain questions about it, but not others. Each set of questions arises out of its own particular background in life, its own specific set of problems, and needs answers to those problems. So let's try and unpack this. I want you to imagine a physical map of Europe. That shows us the features of its landscape, its rivers, its lakes, and its mountains. But a political map of Europe shows the borders of its nation states, where one nation ends and another begins. Now, the physical map, might be useful to a tourist who wants to find some nice mountains to climb. But the political map, might be useful to a refugee who is seeking asylum. Do you see the point? Same reality, but different aspects of it being mapped in this way. And Midgley's point is this, and I quote her, "There is only one world, but a big one." And from that, Midgley draws the conclusion we need multiple maps to do justice to its vast scope and range. And the point really is that actually each map makes sense of the whole landscape only by answering certain questions about it and not others. So to get an overall view of this complex reality, we have to say that one map on its own is not good enough. It's incomplete. We need to find ways of bringing maps together so they can be laid over each other, and we see a full picture of the region. Each map answers different questions, and these maps need somehow to be brought together. So how does this relate to science and faith? Well, here's the way I see it, and see if this makes sense to you. Science maps our world at one level, explaining how it functions. That's great, we need that. Religion maps our world at another level, explaining what it means, what we mean. And we need to superimpose these maps so that all this information is at our disposal. Each map is to be respected, but it's incomplete. It needs supplementation. So a scientific map helps us to understand how we as human beings function. And that's really important. That's important medically. But a theological map helps us to understand our deeper needs, our existential needs. And that's important physically. So I've talked about three ways of thinking about the relation of the natural sciences and religious faith. They offer us different perspective, different levels, and different maps of reality. And obviously there's a lot more that needs to be said, but let me emphasize that you don't have to limit yourself to one of them. If one of them is right, that does not mean the other two are wrong. They simply help us to understand how science and religious faith fit together into a bigger picture of reality. Each method, each map fills in part of a big picture, but not the whole of that picture. So again, different sciences use different research disciplines, and these build up to give you a bigger picture. So if you're like Richard Dawkins and insist that science alone is your guide to reality, then you've chosen to see only part of that picture. The picture that results through looking through one window, through one research method. And you mistakenly assert this is the whole of the picture. And what you're doing is you're limiting yourself to one research method and saying this is the only one on which I shall rely. Here is a little analogy you may find helpful. I want to imagine I have a thermometer in my hand. I don't, but imagine I do. And I might say, look, this thermometer works perfectly well in telling me my temperature. And because it works so well at doing that, I can use it for everything. Therefore, I can use this thermometer to tell me the meaning of life. So I take up my thermometer, I look at it and say, oh dear, it doesn't seem to tell me anything about the meaning of life. Therefore, there is no meaning of life. And in my view, that's what Richard Dawkins does. He takes a tool that works well in one domain of life, the sciences. And it says, hey, it works perfectly well there. Let's use it for everything. But you see, it doesn't. It's limited. It works very well in its own domain. Let's keep it like that. That's one of the reasons why Marian Midgley was so critical of Dawkins, because he failed to respect the complexity of our world. For Midgley, for me too, I have to say, no single intellectual method can grasp or represent our world adequately. And if we insist on using only one method, then we ended up with an emaciated and impoverished account of reality. We need a set of intellectual toolboxes, not one that we use for everything. So for Midgley, I have to say for me as well, The quality of our thinking about the world needs to be as deep and as complex as the world that we hope to understand. And this often means we have to live with some uncertainty about the beliefs we developed. Now, remember earlier I mentioned as a teenage atheist, I was intolerant of uncertainty. I wanted to know everything for certain. And when I realized that actually atheism couldn't be proved, I began to realize it wasn't that simple. Now, one of the reasons why I enjoy reading the philosopher Bertrand Russell is that he faces up to this problem. Instead of running away from the issue, he confronts it head on. I want you to listen to this sentence in his History of Western Philosophy, and I quote him: "To teach us how to live without certainty, and yet without being paralyzed by hesitation, is perhaps the chief thing that philosophy can do for us." Russell's saying we have to learn to live without certainty. But Russell is often described as an atheist philosopher. And in one sense, that's right. Russell didn't believe in God, but Russell was absolutely clear. Atheism cannot be proved to be right. And Russell simply applies his own principle of living and thinking without certainty to his own beliefs. He chose to live as an atheist, but he knew he couldn't prove that position to be right. And that's very different from Richard Dawkins, who seems to think his own ideas are exempt from critical examination on the basis of the criteria by which he judges others. Now, I used to be a scientist, and my first Oxford degree was in chemistry. Then I did an Oxford doctorate in the biological sciences. And I just want to say that we need to be aware that science is often said to prove its theories, but actually, I think the truth is that really scientists have to make judgments about which theories make the most sense of observations, knowing that these may be shown to be wrong in the future when a better theory comes along. There's a degree of uncertainty here. And, if you study the history and philosophy of science, as I did, then you realize that the history of science is littered with theories that were once thought to be right, but have now been abandoned. And maybe you know these famous words of the historian Arthur Koestler. He writes, "The progress of science is strewn like an ancient desert trail with the bleak skeletons of discarded theories which once seemed to possess eternal life." Now, if you're a scientific positivist, those words will sound a bit heretical, but I'm afraid the history of science shows that they're entirely justified. So I must, I think, begin to wind up because I want to give plenty of times for questions and answers. And really what I want to say to you is that I'm talking to you as somebody who began as an atheist. Really believing this gave me certainty about life's big questions. And in effect, it reflected this idea that science and religion are in permanent warfare. And I don't think that anymore. Science has a wonderful capacity to explain, but it doesn't answer all of life's questions. Let me end by going back to Albert Einstein, to a very famous lecture he gave at Princeton in 1939. And he was very critical of those who said science can answer all of our big questions. Here's what Einstein said. Listen to this. "The scientific method can teach us nothing else beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other." And Einstein was absolutely clear that science can help us to achieve certain goals, but it doesn't give us a motivation to actually achieve those. It doesn't tell us what is right, what is good. We need to find some way of answering those from some other source. So as I bring this lecture to a close, I simply want to make the point. In saying science cannot answer all of life's big questions, I am not in any way criticizing science. I'm saying it's science. Let's respect that. Let's, in effect, avoid making science into something else, which it is not. Science isn't philosophy, it isn't theology, it isn't ethics. It's a very important area of science. Let's respect it. but bring into the conversation other areas of human thought, which in effect help us in this way. So the key point for me is that we need a richer and deeper way of engaging our world, which both helps to understand how things work, but also what they mean. So if you like, we need a stereoscopic view of our world if we are to appreciate its depth and its complexity. And for me, I make it clear this is me, doesn't have to be you. Science offers us one lens, but faith offers us another. Science is great, but it needs supplementation. But I think you can take these two things together and not simply make sense of our world, but also live meaningfully within it. Thank you so much for listening. I'm now very happy to take questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. We have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for Q&A, and there are plenty of questions lined up, so we'll start at the beginning. The first question is, I often hear from students that are skeptical of religion that it's just quote unquote made up. For example, it's equivalent to the flying spaghetti monster faith. What are some of the ways that we can engage with them in dialogue?
I think what I want to say is that very often people make up atheism because they do not want there to be anything beyond them. They want to make their own rules. They want to be completely autonomous. And we need to make it absolutely clear that what Freud calls wish fulfillment, in other words, inventing a worldview that suits your needs, applies to atheism as much as to religion. That's a very important point to make. Everyone has to say why they believe something is right. There's no question of, in effect, just being allowed to assert, I think this is right, therefore it is right. You need to say, here are the reasons I think this is right. And very often in the natural sciences, you judge a theory by how well it makes sense of observations. In other words, you line up all the observations, you say, here are three possible theories. Let's ask how each of them is able to account for these observations. How well does it fit that in? And that's how, in effect, I became a Christian, feeling that Christianity offered a better way of reading the world than my earlier atheism. So I think what I would want to say is that there are many skeptics in the world, and I'm one of them. I'm skeptical about atheism. I'm skeptical about anything that is dogmatic and goes beyond the evidence. And I have many atheist friends here in Oxford who just say, look, we cannot prove our beliefs. And we know that. So we're very happy to have a civilized conversation about what we think and why. And I want to encourage that. What I do find difficult are very dogmatic religious people and very dogmatic atheists, because both of them seem to be unwilling to realize that actually each of their positions is a faith that cannot be proved to be right. You can justify atheism, you can justify religious faith, but that's in effect saying, here are some reasons for thinking this is right. It's not about proof. So in many ways, what I'm saying is let's have a civilized conversation, realizing that these things are more difficult than you might think. The key point here is that you can prove shallow truths. 2 and 2 make 4, great. But you cannot prove deep truths about the meaning of life, the reason why we're here. And to me, that's a very important point. So thank you for that first great question.
All right. Next question is that we frequently see statistics that a large number of scientists believe in a personal God. However, we also see statistics from things like the National Academy of Scientists that the vast majority of quote unquote elite scientists do not believe in a personal God. Can you share your perspective on this?
It's very interesting. These are very often questionnaires which ask questions which very often are badly framed. For example, do you believe in a personal God? Now, Einstein did not believe in a personal God. I'm sure you know that. And very often people say, hey, Einstein didn't believe in a personal God. He was an atheist. Well, no. Einstein was adamant. I am not an atheist. Einstein's conception of God was impersonal. It was the idea of a mind behind the universe. So you've got to be careful about this. I think the evidence suggests that there are lots of scientists who are religious believers of one sort or another. A lot of them want to keep their heads down because actually it can be quite difficult to talk about your faith in American culture at the moment because it's a bit polarized. I think you all know. But what I would say is that there's no good reason for thinking that being engaged in a scientific scientific profession makes you less likely to be a religious person. I mean, if I can put it like this, I mean, science is not intrinsically religious. It's not intrinsically atheistic. It can be read atheistically, it can be read religiously, and there are people on both sides who in effect take their faith and in effect hold it together with their scientific practice. So what I'd want to say is, as I know from my experience here in Oxford, is there are lots of scientists who are active religious believers who in effect see their science as enriching their faith and their faith as enriching their science.
All right. So how did the gospel message itself impact your Christian conversion beyond just its creedal significance as a better alternative to the previously held atheistic one? Was there any personal encounter or some sort that you went through?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I mean, as I said earlier, my conversion was a bit on the cerebral and intellectual side, and in effect, for me, what really brought me to faith was its capacity to make sense of things. Now, a lot of people listening to me will say, "Well, hey, that's not a very good reason." I mean, what about loving God? What about the meaning of life and things like that? And that's right. And what I want to say to you is that's how my faith started. But it didn't stop there. In effect, even like this is my way in. This is what, in effect, made me realize this is very exciting. I'm going to explore this. And as I explored Christianity, I discovered there was a lot more to it than simply making sense of the world. There was, in effect, the idea of being loved by God. There was the idea of purpose. The idea of, in effect, being enabled to act in certain ways. A whole series of things which need to be added to this. But that was how I, in effect, came into this. Now, I'm sure if we were to look at the many people who are actually watching this conversation and tell us your story, it'd be very different. I want to make that point. I'm not saying my story is in any way typical or representative or normative. I'm just saying this is my story. But it didn't stop there. It kind of way became enriched by other things. And the question about the role of other people, for example, is very important because it was through talking to other people who were Christians, I began to realize I'd misunderstood Christianity. They helped me to understand more about what Christianity was all about. But one of my friends, I think in absolute frustration, I kept asking him awkward questions about the Trinity and things like that, said, "Please go and read C.S. Lewis." And I did that. And actually, that was a wonderful introduction to a writer who I still read and value to this very day.
All right. So the next question is that sometimes there seems to be an intersection between science and faith. For example, the multiverse theory is used as justification for life coming about through chance by multiplying the attempts to be infinite. Is multiverse theory a valid explanation of the universe? And how should a Christian consider such a theory and their faith?
I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, there was this very important debate about whether there's a single universe or whether there's a multiverse. And actually, as a scientist, I have misgivings about the multiverse. I'll tell you why. My misgiving is this, is that the scientific method in one sense is saying that the way we experience this world gives us principles that we can use for interpreting the universe as a whole. The multiverse hypothesis means that we don't know whether the principles that govern this world apply elsewhere. And therefore, it does actually place some significant limits on how we can actually understand other universes if indeed they exist. As to whether they are religiously significant, I don't know. I mean, for a while, Richard Dawkins thought that the multiverse was anti-religious. I think most people would now say that this is very difficult to argue. Actually, you can argue for the case for both actually quite easily. My own view simply is, as a scientist, I cannot make this judgment, but I can say something which is very important. I have many scientific friends who believe in the single universe and many scientific friends who believe in the multiverse, but they can't adjudicate the question on the basis of the available evidence. And it's just a very good example of people of integrity and intelligence, in effect saying, I believe that this is right, but I can't prove this is right. In my heart, I say this is right, but I can't prove it. I think that is a very interesting parallel, of course, to religious faith. Thank you.
All right. Next question says, "Hi, Alistair. Can you distinguish more between about the difference between the first and third ways of looking at science and faith? Is it just different ways of saying that both are needed for looking at the world truthfully?"
I think that the general point I was trying to make is that each intellectual discipline uses its own distinct methods to engage reality. I mean, a chemist and a biologist will use different methods, and they can kind of weave those together. And my favorite example is actually from a evolutionary biologist who asked us to imagine 5 biologists looking at sitting around a clearing in the forest, and they watch a frog jump. And the question is, why does a frog jump? And one biologist who specializes in muscle movements say, oh, well, it's because of this electrical contraction muscles. And others, an evolutionary biologist, said, well, of course, it had to develop in this way to avoid predators and so on. And they all give answers from their own distinct biological discipline. And the point being made by Stephen Rose, who's this biochemist who I was talking about, is that each of these answers is right, but it's only part of a bigger picture. And I think in giving those analogies, really what I was saying is, look, you've got to be very careful you don't think a part of the picture is the whole picture. And we've got to realize we've got to find some way of, in effect, bringing all these things together and giving us this deeper and richer vision of reality. So, I mean, you could say that they're saying pretty much the same thing. I think they probably are, but nevertheless, the analogies are different. And you may find that one analogy is easier for you to understand or you appreciate more. So basically, the key principle in every case is a big, complex world. No single method is good enough to render it. We need multiple perspectives or renderings to do justice to this world. And we need to be able to engage questions like value and meaning and purpose, and not simply functionality.
All right. Next question is, what do you think about the idea that science is a study of phenomenon existing in nature and reality, being God's creation, and is therefore a way to learn of God, whereas God exists outside of science and is not bound by it, thus God is the source of all science?
Well, I think what I would say is that I fully accept that God is the ultimate source of everything, really, including my motivation to want to understand the world. Because if you're a Christian, then you'll kind of look at the natural world through a theological lens or framework. And you'll see it not simply as nature, but as God's creation. And you'll take the view that, if I look at a painting, I can learn something of the artist by looking at the painting. If I read a book, I can learn something about the author by looking at the book. Likewise, by studying God's work in creation, I can appreciate God all the more. Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God. So actually, the point I'm trying to make is that the desire to do science is actually an expression of a desire to know more about God by looking at the natural world in greater detail and appreciating it as God's creation, and then moving your line of thought from creation to creator. So the kind of approach I've outlined is very respectful of the points that question makes. I think that I'm very clear God is the ultimate source of all knowledge, and I value that. But I'm also saying that, in effect, by engaging the world, it gives you this perspective on God. It doesn't cause it, but it amplifies or enriches your understanding of God, which arises through conversion or through reading the Bible.
All right. The next question is, isn't the interpretation of the biblical texts a science as it was once called, quote unquote, the science of theology? And what happened?
Well, people did talk about the science of theology in the Middle Ages, using the Latin word scientia. But the word science has changed its meaning. I'm sure you all know this, but if not, I'll gladly tell you. In the Middle Ages, science meant any intellectual discipline. At some point around the year 1830, and probably through the influence of the British writer John Ruskin, the word science began to mean natural science. So actually, in English, we use the word science to mean natural science. If you have a conversation with a German friend, for example, and you use the word Wissenschaft, I mean, Wissenschaft in German can mean natural science, but basically means an intellectual discipline in general. So what I need to say to you is that theology is a discipline, but it's not a natural science. But it is a discipline which helps you to make more sense of both why the natural sciences work so well, but also what the limits of the natural sciences are. And I think it's very important, because in saying science is limits, you're not criticizing them. You're just saying that's the nature of what science is. It answers some questions and not others.
All right. And where does the Bible fit into the aquarium analogy? Is it one of the windows? Is it something bigger, or not at all?
Well, I think that it's a rough analogy, and all analogies, I think, let you down at points. But with that particular approach, I would say that if you like, the Bible gives you a way of looking at things, and that's the window you look through. So if you like, the Bible is helping you to see things in a certain way. I'm sure you all know this, but the Greek word metanoia, that we very often translate as repentance, actually means even more than that. It's all about a radical change of mind. And what you can say is the radical change of mind, which happens when you become a Christian, gives you this window through which you can look. But as a scientist and a Christian, you can actually use your faith perspective and your science perspective and bring these together to give a richer understanding of what this is all about.
All right. So Stephen Jay Gould, in his book Ever Since Darwin, says that facts do not speak for themselves. They are read in the light of theory. Science is not a mechanized, robot-like accumulation of objective information, leading by laws of logic to inescapable interpretation. If this is true, how can Dawkins and others claim that science is the only reliable and authoritative means of ascertaining truth about reality? Would they not have to concede that every scientist interprets empirical data through a presupposed paradigm, as per Thomas Kuhn's observation?
Well, Stephen Jay Gould is simply right that you see things through a theoretical lens. That in effect, every scientist, every human being, when you see something, you see it as something. There's always an element of theoretical interpretation. Before Copernicus, we saw the sun go below the horizon. After Copernicus, we see the Earth rotating, so the sun seems to go beneath the horizon. And the key point is that Richard Dawkins is completely philosophically and historically illiterate. He has not read Thomas Kuhn. He has not read Karl Popper. And in effect, as a result, he makes enormously simplistic statements about science that are simply inattentive to the difficulties every other scientist knows about and is able to weave into their thinking. And the price of being a scientific positivist like Dawkins, you simply disengage from philosophy and from history. And Gould is right. He's saying that you always look at things through a theoretical lens, whether you're aware of it or not. And in many ways, the key question is there a better theoretical lens I could look for? It's not as if you look at the universe and you see it without a theoretical framework. You're doing that implicitly, whether you realize it or not.
All right. You mentioned a smug sense of superiority as an atheist, and I've seen many Christians on both sides of the aisle scientifically that can't let go of that smug sense of superiority, aka their pride. How have you, as a Christian, nurtured intellectual humility since your conversion? Any advice for situations where pride is central to or fueling divisiveness in the church?
Well, I think there are two things here. One is that there's a sense that the more you know you don't know. I mean, I sound stupid, but for everything you understand, there are about 6 things beyond it you don't understand. So you become aware of the limits of your own knowledge. You become aware of the fragility of human knowledge. I think that's a very important point. But I think the other point that I think does need to be made is that the accumulation of knowledge actually isn't really very exciting. That what really matters is not the accumulation of knowledge, but something deeper, which we call wisdom. Wisdom is about interpreted knowledge. It's about assimilated knowledge. It's about being able to take things you know and do wise and good things through them. And very often humility is seen as integral to wisdom. And I agree with that, actually. And of course, fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. I think that's also very important as well. So what I would say is that I think I now know how little I know. And I now know that some of the things that I know actually aren't all that important. But there are some things I know are really important, like there is a God, God makes a big difference to me. And actually, through a lens shaped by God, everything looks so different. That's very important. I think that's a good thought to take away.
All right, so we're going to try to answer questions here for the next 5 minutes or so. The next one is, hi, Alastair, you emphasized the importance of seeing science as something that cannot exclusively address all questions. To what extent should we reverse the logic and expect people in the church to also be conversant with science? As a mathematician, I find myself wishing that more people had an appreciation for my field, but also wonder if it's an issue worth addressing in the church and what it would look like to go about doing that in a way that respects the different interests and skills of different people. Given your background in ministry, do you have any thoughts on this question?
I think this is a really good question. I mean, the Bible doesn't tell me how far away from the earth the moon is. Science doesn't tell you what the meaning of life is. So we kind of, to have a rounded picture, we need both. But I think you're right that it's very difficult to have these conversations in church because there is this stereotype that science is atheistic or science leads you away from God, and it doesn't. I mean, it can be interpreted to be atheistic, but it's not. There's a very interesting survey published recently by Elaine Eklund. Elaine Eklund is a sociologist at Rice University, and one of her interests is trying to understand what it is that shapes people's attitude towards science and religion. And she and her colleagues did a survey, and they asked what's the most effective way of changing people's minds in churches or elsewhere. Sorry, I hit my laptop there. About the relation of science and faith. And here's what she said, and this might actually be helpful to you. She said that the best answer is not to give good arguments, but to be able to point to someone who in effect is a scientist or a mathematician who has integrated their faith and their science. People will say, look, he's done it, she's done it, so I can do it as well. The importance of exemplars, people who have done this. So people of faith can look at them and say, hey, it can be done. And maybe I could do that as well. I think that's really important. We need role models in churches who will not necessarily say study science, but will actually say it's really worth doing. And I'm here to tell you this can be done. So don't be frightened about this relationship between faith and science. Thank you.
All right. Now, next question. Can you please explain how God alters the way you view the world?
How God alters the way I view the world. God gives me a way of looking at the world, which I find in the Bible and in the long Christian tradition of reflecting on the Bible, which is like a lens. And I look through this and I see something that's much more sharply in focus than otherwise would be the case. It's not that, if you like, God directly tells me what things are like. It's that through the Christian faith, I have this way of looking at the world, which brings things into sharper focus than otherwise would be the case. But C.S. Lewis, at 1 or 2 points, talk about God being like a sun illuminating a landscape. And that's a helpful model because it makes the point that actually God is the basis of all our understanding. I think that's a really important point to bear in mind here.
All right, and I think the last question we're going to ask is really a two-part question. The first part is that you are known as an evolutionary creationist. How should Christians discuss the different views for creation? So I guess that'll be the first part. And the second question is that there are different interpretations of Adam and Eve, whether they really existed or are representative of human beings, Homo sapiens, etc. What's your position on them?
I think with all these questions, I mean, you asked the question, how should we take these positions? The answer is with some respect, because it's very, very difficult to answer these questions unambiguously and fully. I mean, I think that a biological theory of evolution is the best way of making sense of things, but I can see how God can work through that. And Richard Dawkins' interpretation of evolution is wrong. I mean, it is, in effect, a metaphysical naturalism imposed upon scientific theory, along with a sort of intrinsic atheism. So we need to make that absolutely clear, that Dawkins is grafting on both a philosophy, materialism, and a theology, atheism, onto his reading of that theory of evolution. So I think that Christians can, I think, find their way to a meaningful solution of this question: how do I hold together evolution and my faith? I think each of us has to do this in our own way. I can tell you how I've done this, but that's me, and I don't want to impose my views on others. On Adam and Eve, that's a really difficult question, because we're not absolutely sure how best to go about interpreting this, either scientifically or indeed theologically, because there is this very important question as to whether we are to see Adam and Eve as, in effect, prototypical figures, not just individuals. So I think the short answer to two very good but very difficult questions is that these are things where I think you need to take your time and be patient as you think these things through, talk them through with your friends, and kind of way keep cool, think about this, and you'll eventually find your way to a position to say, actually, I think this works for me. I think it makes sense, and that in effect may work for you, may not work for anybody else, but that's the position you found, and very often that's the best we can do in these situations.
All right. I think we have run out of time for questions, but thank you all so much for asking those questions. Those were fantastic. And Dr. McGrath, I really would just love to thank you. That was wonderful, very engaging, and I thank you for so thoughtfully and civilly and charitably answering all of the questions that were posed for us today. So thank you so much for your time.
Be my pleasure, and thank you so much for having me. Hope the next session goes well too.
Thank you. Take care. We really appreciate it. And now, everybody, we are going to take a short break. And then at 2:30, we're going to start. Dr. Ken Keekly is going to discuss with us Genesis, evolution, dinosaurs, and more. And I think that some of the questions that you all were asking, especially toward the end of this talk, are very applicable to that next discussion. So we encourage you, if you're able, to hang on and attend that one as well. But thank you all so much for participating, and we hope to see you again soon.